This is part 2 of the lecture, Mexico's PRI and the Challenge of a One-Party State. So I was mentioning at the end of the first part of this that, because these guys are all operating, and they're all guys, there hasn't been a female president of Mexico, and there won't be, I don't think, for a long time. Because these guys are all operating together, they will sometimes kind of cover, things for each other. And the problem with this idea is that Cardenas really saw it as a kind of left-right swing, but mostly it's been a center-right swing more than a center-left or right-left swing, in fact. In practice, we see that there's a lot of kind of talking about the revolution while having extremely conservative politics at home. And there's no better example of this than the administration of someone named Díaz Ordaz, who was a president in 1968. And his administration was incredibly left-wing in its foreign policy. It was constantly questioning the United States and Latin America. It was a big supporter of Cuba. There was a lot of rhetorical support for the left. But domestically, it was so conservative that its opponents were literally murdered. I mean, if you stood up against this regime, you could be shot down. And this was very, very clear in 1968 itself, when Mexico was hosting the Summer Olympics. And I just want to warn you, the Summer Olympics back then were not as driven by television. And so they were when it was best for things. And since Mexico City gets quite hot, they were actually in the fall, but they were the Summer Olympics. And in 1968, there was a horrible massacre in the center of Mexico City at the Plaza de Tlatelolco. The PRI wanted to have the Olympics in Mexico to show its great success, that Mexico was a leader in the third world, that it was developing rapidly. They built a new subway system. They were going to show off the success of this regime. But many young students chose July 26th to honor the Cuban Revolution. You can see the influence of Che and Fidel. Remember, it's the 26th of July movement that wins the Cuban Revolution. That they protest the regime, and the government doesn't like this and pushes back. And this leads to more protests. A month later, on August 27th, about 500,000 people protested in something called the Zócalo, which is one of the biggest squares in Mexico City. And it was the largest anti-government rally in Mexican history. And the police killed many people there. We're not sure of the numbers. And then a couple months later, the police violently dispersed protests in the Plaza de Tlatelolco near the big university, which is known as the UNAM. And there was the worst violence since the revolution itself. Well, what happened on October 2nd? There were student protests, and there were about 5,000 people there. And at 6:30 p.m., the military moved into the plaza. It ordered the protesters to leave. And when they didn't leave, the military decided that they were going to disperse them with machine guns. Machine guns mounted on helicopters shot into the crowd. This was a horrible uprising. There aren't a lot of good pictures of it. The government clamped down very quickly. You can see there are students stripped to their underwear, up against the wall, being taken off to jail. And again, here are the details. It was in something called the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco and near the university. So 5,000 students, when the army ordered them to disperse, they were fired upon. And at first, the government said, oh, yes, it was horrible. 8 people died. And 8 people dead would be horrible, of course. Then they upped the number to 18, and later their official number was 43. Most people estimate it was between 350 and 400 people murdered. Now, this is, and more than 2,000 people arrested. Now, this is horrible any way you slice it, but it's important to keep the context in mind. These, Latin America, poor people always suffer. They were tortured when they were arrested, they often killed. These were university students. These were middle-class kids and upper-middle-class kids and maybe some elite kids and kids who had parents in the government. So this was a real trauma. And this massacre at Tlatelolco really showed everyone that the regime had drifted very far to the right from the days of Cardenas. The most conservative elements of the constitutionalists were now in charge. If you were to say, well, the constitutionalist movement that becomes the PRI starts off with Obregón. A lot of people would say, no, it's to the right of Carranza. And if you don't remember, back in the revolution, the election of the revolution, Carranza is the much more conservative of the two. And Obregón was the one who had much closer ties to labor and so forth. Some people said, look, you can find within the PRI itself people who like Porfirio Diaz, who are speaking about how Porfirio Diaz had developed Mexico. So they claim to be revolutionary, but they have more in common with the guy the revolution overthrew than with the ideals of many in the revolution. So there's a really big question. How did this happen? How did the revolution turn so far right? Well, popular demands had been pushed through the state since the 1920s, right? That you worked in, corporatist unions, and then, Cardenas did this and that. But that also meant that there was no way for people to seek something outside the state. There's no way to ask for more rights through democracy. Everything is about being in the state. And this was really a good deal for elites, right? So I said the state acted like a protection racket, but, the elites ended up getting the better part of the deal. And it alienated many people in the popular classes. They didn't really have a way to push for things. I mean, in Brazil, a lot of the pushing for things was opposing the dictatorship, opposing the corporate state. Here, a non-military dictatorship, something that did not even claim to be dictatorship, was mowing down students protesting in the streets. So this is a big question, right? That one of the ideas is that, Mexico was in the vanguard. But today, I'm going to go back to the late the 1980s and 1990s, but today, Mexico lags the rest of Latin America. The PRI lost control when a conservative named Vicente Fox, who comes from a very conservative party that represents industrial interests in the North, won. Because when there's a lot of pressure to open up the system, they'll open it up to a conservative, but they would never let the left take power. And we know this because the left almost did take power. In the 1988 presidential election, the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, with the wonderful name of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas Solorzano, Cuauhtémoc was, I believe, the nephew of Montezuma, and he was the one who fought against the Spanish in 1519. So it's a very heroic name to give this Aztec warrior your son. He broke away from the PRI and founded a party on the left. And he took on the PRI candidate, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, in the election and was well ahead in the vote counting when suddenly the computers counting the votes simply stopped. And when the counting resumed, the following day, mysteriously, Salinas had won. Well, Cuauhtémoc was always associated with his father, who was, obviously a hero to the PRI, even though he ended up founding this National Democratic Front. So there is Cuauhtémoc, quite small, and so the big picture of his father. And he lost to Carlos Salinas. But he probably didn't lose. This was clearly a stolen election because there was no way the powers in Mexico were going to turn things over to the left. Salinas was one of the most corrupt men to ever lead Mexico. He was just deeply corrupt. His brother is in jail. He's in exile. We're going to come back to Salinas because he's a very important actor in the creation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Act. He was just a horrible man in many, many ways. He was a Harvard graduate, I believe undergraduate and graduate degree, came from a powerful family, and was very interested in just, tying the Mexican economy closer and closer to the American economy, and didn't pay much attention to what happened to the average Mexican. And this was really, this moment of 1988 is so significant because we see the son of Lázaro Cárdenas being beaten by the worst tendencies in the party that Lázaro Cárdenas helped create. And this helps us explain why the PRI allowed this guy Vicente Fox, and if you're confused by his name, his parents actually, his grandfather migrated from Cincinnati to Mexico in the late 19th century. It was willing to let someone in the PAN, the party called the PAN, win, but they would never let the left win. And as I said, Fox was very close to the United States. His paternal grandfather was born in Cincinnati and migrated to Mexico to make his fortune. And Vicente Fox himself was a successful businessman who was president of the most archetypal, of American companies, who's president of Coca-Cola de Mexico. And he oversaw all of Coke's Latin American sales. He was elected the governor of the northern state of Guanajuato as a PAN candidate. And the PAN is a very conservative, pro-U.S., pro-business party. So the PRI, as it kind of devolves into being more and more conservative, when it leaves power by allowing the right to win, but never the left. So in the final analysis, we can see that the PRI, at the end of the day, really fears the popular classes more than it feared an elite rival. And that's really problematic. And going forward, there are big questions about the future of Mexican politics. In 2013, the PRI did win the presidency again. But, Mexico is still a very, very closed system. And that's a bit of an outlier because most of the region is highly democratic. And being democratic, popular class demands are at least addressed. They're not always perfectly met, but they're addressed. Mexico's been racked by violence, and there seems to be little movement for the development of a more robust democracy. The economy sometimes does well and sometimes doesn't, but democracy doesn't seem to be much on the agenda there. And in this way, Mexico, which for many years was in the vanguard, really lags the rest of Latin America.